Another important concept to understand is identity and access management. This is essentially the processes, tools, and personnel that manage the users, their accesses, and what permissions those users have, as well as the accounting of those events, essentially the logging and auditing of that activity. This is commonly referred to as AAA, authentication, authorization, and accounting. So just like we talked about before in the CIA triad, we talked about authentication and authorization and accounting. However, identity and access management is a program in of itself, and depending on the size of an organization, they might have a dedicated person whose sole job is to do identity and access management for the organization, who has administrative rights to our cloud resources. I need to give developers access to this new tool. We need to audit the logs of users logging in so that we can assess for any risky behavior. This is the role and expectations of this type of job within the security organization. And again, with authentication, we validate the authenticity and validity of credentials provided. We authorize those credentials to access information within our systems, whether that is internal to our network, in our cloud resources, our SaaS applications, wherever our data, and by and large, wherever the organization has authoritative control, we must manage the users and their access and permissions therein. It is unacceptable in this day and age to have blanket access for users for the simple fact of having access to the network. That does not work anymore, and this is how organizations are consistently compromised. And that brings us to zero trust. Zero trust is the principle that just because you have access to the network does not mean you have implied trust. Traditionally, when you look at legacy networks that used strictly the old school defense and depth strategy without accounting for cloud and that porous nature that is the modern operating network, essentially when users accessed the network in the old model, they were given access to a wide range of services and resources in the network just because they were authorized and in the network. This model doesn't work anymore. Social engineering is one of the largest and most effective attack vectors against users in organizations. So compromising a user's account and credentials gives them implicit access to a great deal of resources and systems within an organization. So systems and networks that do not apply a zero trust or a more granular method of controlling access leave themselves wide open to account takeover, credential misuse in their organization, which ultimately leads to a network breach that potentially is newsworthy. The challenges of zero trust is that requires a lot of visibility. You have to know where your data at, it's being logged, you're accounting for who's accessing that data, who's accessing the data, how are they accessing the data, and what state or context is that device and user attempting to access that data. And that sounds a little bit complex, and it somewhat is for standard or traditional organizations to sort of pivot from a defense in depth perimeter defense approach to a zero trust model, because it turns identity and access management on its head. So Google was one of the first organizations to really push and conceptualize the zero trust model. And they created something called Beyond Corp. It's their vision for what zero trust is and what it looks like. So let's break down this somewhat confusing chart to get a better understanding of what zero trust is. So in this diagram, we have a few different device classifiers or groups or behaviors of devices, and they denoted them by color. Blue, we have sort of users, external, untrusted networks. And look at the terminology used, untrusted or unprivileged. This is on purpose because in a zero trust model, essentially everything is unprivileged and untrusted until verified at that point in time. But beyond that point in time, it isn't trusted anymore. It's only trusted when it needs to be. And this ensures that a device that was valid and trustworthy 5 minutes ago didn't get compromised a few minutes later and is still seen as a trusted asset in the organization. Compromise can occur at any moment in time, so not giving implicit trust for a length of period in the organization is preferred in case of breach, vice saying, hey, for the next 8 hours, you've told me who you are, you showed me your identity, go have fun, go access what you need, because in that 8 hours, anything can happen, and anything can happen is not a good way to manage and assess risk and mitigate risk. So again, we have blue, unmanaged, untrusted devices, and then we've got these red devices, a Radius server, access proxy, and a single sign-on system. Essentially, these devices provide accounting and access. Who is trying to access? It's where you provide initial credentials. It's a portal to gain access to a data or service on the inside. We then go through these assets in green. These are the core systems and processes that make up Zero Trust. Essentially, their role is to manage that request at that point in time and to infer, should we trust this device and user or not trust this device and user? And you can see everything in this diagram is readily available, and we're already accounting for all the things we talked about we needed for good identity and access management. We've got device inventory. We're keeping track of the devices, the state of those devices, the behavior of those devices. We've got user and group database, where we know of the users, the groups, their privileges. What are they authorized to? When was the last time they authenticated? How long have they been authenticated? And one of the biggest pieces in the Zero Trust model is that trust inference appliance. It is essentially a system and a series of analytics that in real time is looking at the device state, the device behaviors and historical activity, as well as the user state and the user historical activity. And it is inferring and predicting, do we trust? Do we not trust? And if we trust, we allow implicit or specific, I should say, access to the resource requested for that point in time only. We will not allow it beyond this point. You have my trust now, you do not have it later. You must go through this whole process again every time something is accessed in the network. And this Zero Trust model really, really cuts down on abuse of credentials and insider threats and manipulation of traditional attack vectors in an organization. An adversary, when they gain access to an organization, first and foremost is going to escalate their privileges, and they're going to do that by looking for credentials. They're looking for administrative credentials, they're looking for other user credentials, and they will use those credentials to traverse the network and manipulate the network. So a Zero Trust model really cuts down on that type of activity or the techniques that a malicious adversary can use if they've compromised the network. And that's really what security is all about, putting enough controls in play that it makes it that much harder for an adversary to conduct their operations and gain the appropriate success on their objectives that they got into the network for in the first place. The ultimate goal of security is to make your network such a hard target that an adversary in their risk assessment deems that it is not worth their time and effort, because the likelihood of success and the results or consequence of that success for whatever goals they're looking for, whether money, intellectual property, trade secrets, whatever it is too low a likelihood of occurring. So believe it or not, adversaries do their own risk assessments, and our job is to make their risk assessment look grim. So let's deviate a little bit and talk about the general types of security. And I mean more in being proactive or reactive. And it's very easy to walk into an organization and sort of see where they are in that journey. Are they strictly reactive, or are they trying to be proactive, or are they fully proactive in their approaches to security? They both have their pros and cons. But ideally, we want to get to a proactive state, because you can't be proactive if you don't have your reactive security game pretty much squared away. By and large, traditional security is reactive. This is simply the process of buying the latest and greatest gadgets and tools, getting pitched, buying them, bringing them in, installing it, turning them on, and waiting for an alert or a red light or something to say, hey, something's bad's going on. Essentially, reactive security is waiting to react to something. And while we need to have reactive security, we need to have endpoint security to protect our endpoints. We need network security to protect the protocols and communications. We need signatures and firewall rules and detection analytics to detect and alert to things. We need to do penetration tests to assess the security of a system or application. We need to run vulnerability scans. We need to do incident response planning, and we need network segmentation to restrict the ability to move around in our network. We need all of these things because at the end of the day, they belong to just your basic cyber hygiene. There are some core things we can do in cyber hygiene that we're going to talk about in a minute, but these are the things that pretty much any security program should have up and running. And unfortunately, I've seen many organizations that do not have all of these. And this leads them wide open, and this keeps them in that reactive state because they don't have the necessary visibility of all of their layers, their defense in depth, and let's hope that and assume they're using the newer application of it, accounting for this porous cloud SaaS-based organizational context. But if they don't have all of these solutions and capabilities and processes and people, they have gaps in their visibility, they have gaps in their knowledge. They are always going to be reacting to things that they don't know. And that is the industry at large, but we can do a great deal better by being proactive about what we do know and looking for things and assessing things and testing things and evaluating and doing knowledge gap assessments and doing threat hunting. And that's what we're going to talk a little more on the next slide, but we need to get to a state beyond reactive. We need reactive, but it's not the end all be all. And we can think of proactive security as the thoughtful accounting of risk. We're taking risks seriously. We're assessing our risk to the organization. And remember, if we're assessing risk, we know what our critical assets are, we know how they're used, we know how they impact the business, and we know the consequences of that risk if left unchecked. So because we understand this, and also because our reactive security solutions are up and running and we've got a pretty good handle on that, we want to be more proactive. We are going to assume that our organization is breached. And that's a good mindset to be in. Most traditional security models and practitioners, not that long ago, 5-10 years ago, really believed their organization was not compromised. My organization is not compromised. I heard that a lot. And every time they were breached, they were reacted. It's very reactionary. Oh man, we're breached. Well, yeah. It's going to happen. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So if we know it's a matter of when, why not assume when is now? And that's the core mental frame of mind you need to be in for proactive security. Proactive security, beyond just doing some of these things as listed here, continually evaluating security requirements and doing risk and threat analyses, evaluating security policy, implementing new standards, essentially creating goals and expectations and governance. You will do this or there is adverse actions. You will be fired. You're not doing your job. Like if there's good governance in place, it really guides the whole organization. So we're doing a lot of these proactive things, threat hunting and knowledge gap assessments to go find threats. And that's because we are of the mindset that our organization is compromised. And hopefully it's not. But this activity of looking for it ensures that we're evaluating our current systems, our processes, our detection mechanisms, our analytics. All of that is being assessed and evaluated on an ongoing basis. And this is really where we need to get in a security standpoint. Most of the breaches you might have heard about online or in the news, if you read into them, usually it's because an organization didn't update something and they weren't monitoring it. They weren't being proactive. They were just waiting for something to tell them what to do, and they didn't think to go beyond, the bare minimums and say to themselves, how does that system impact our security? How does that access impact our customer data or whatever it is? And, took the time to assess that and did a little bit of digging and evaluated it. And that's just simply being proactive. So let's wrap up with cyber hygiene. I mentioned it a few slides ago. The truth of the matter is that if you read into a lot of breaches that have happened in the past number of years, a majority of them could have been prevented altogether, or at least lessened in the degree of what the breach was able to accomplish or what the threat actors were able to do by just adhering to some fundamental or basic cyber hygiene principles. So let's talk about a few of these. First and foremost, I think we've hit home on this a lot. Users. We log their activity, we authenticate them, we authorize them, and we use more advanced authentication mechanisms such as multi-factor authentication. We audit that activity, and we provide cyber awareness training to the users. If the users are not aware of what threats they face from social engineering attacks, phishing emails, then they're going to fall victim to those things, and that's going to open up risk to our organization. It's going to take advantage of the vulnerability in that we have not educated our users, or we are not using a stronger authentication mechanism. If we're not using those things, our users are prime targets for social engineering, and their credentials are easily abused in the network. So that's bad. That's one of the key things we can do. If we secure our authentication mechanisms and credentials our users use, you've stopped a great deal of the attacks faced to many organizations. Hardware. Restrict physical access. We don't want to have default configurations. Disable unused services. We want to do asset tracking and management. We want to know what devices are in our network, that they're not left in a default state, and that only authorized users have access to those devices. Remember, our whole network operates on these physical devices, our routers, switches, and things you'll learn more later in another module. But if somebody has physical access to that, they undermine the integrity of the whole organization. Everything is up for grabs. Physical access is keys to the kingdom, because even an encrypted server or a server with a good password, when there's physical access, I can just take the hard drives, or I can do various techniques to gain access to this system. You can go Google online. If you have physical access to a Windows computer, there's a few things you can do with physical access to basically set up your own admin account on anybody's computer as long as they don't have drive encryption enabled. So physical access is key. It's important. And without good physical access, we undermine the whole network. This is a common one I think most people should understand or will understand. Our software. Update the software. Run a vulnerability management program. Scan for vulnerabilities. Look up softwares and versions for known vulnerabilities. Harden software. Don't leave it in a default configuration or state. This could be web application software. It could be software on our user machine, mobile software. Wherever this software is in your organization, harden it, update it, monitor it. Old, outdated software is also another extremely large attack vector threat actors use once they've gained access to a network. Vulnerable software in the form of web application software is one of the main attack vectors that adversaries use to attack web applications and gain access to databases and internal network resources through internet access, out from the internet in through the front door. They attack web servers that aren't configured appropriately or are running outdated, old, and vulnerable or buggy software. Last but not least, data. Protect our data. Back it up, encrypt it, do data classification. Where is it? Who has access to it? What type of data is it? And that goes into file permissions. So this is all easier said than done, but if this is done, a large degree of the attacks observed that go on daily won't affect organizations that put this stuff into play. Not to say it won't stop them, but it'll make it that much harder for an adversary to be effective. And it'll give you a greater opportunity to detect, deter, and recover from this malicious activity. If you're not doing these things, you don't know if you're breached. They're in your network, they're abusing the systems, and you don't know any difference. So if you like to live in denial, as a lot of organizations do, unfortunately, then don't do these things. But I'm not going to say do that. I'm going to say do your cyber hygiene. So at a minimum, ensure you follow these cyber hygiene principles in your home life, on your personal devices, but also at the workplace. Ensuring that all this stuff gets done ensures that we can secure the network, and the likelihood that an adversary can take advantage of our networks easily cannot be accomplished.